Okay, I want you to imagine, just for a second, the place where you feel the absolute safest. Your home, right? It's a sanctuary, a place meant to protect you from the harshness of the outside world. Now imagine that very same sanctuary slowly, quietly twisting into a sentient prison. A literal labyrinth that doesn't just trap your physical body, but actually begins to dismantle your mind. What happens when the walls themselves become your enemy?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most legendary, universally terrifying tales of our time, Stephen King's The Shining. But we aren't just going to sit here and recount all the spooky moments. We're going to deconstruct the whole shebang. We'll look at exactly how it began, how Stanley Kubrick's iconic film differed from the original novel, and we'll unpack this fascinating academic framework that explains why this story still manages to terrify us on such a primal level. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll say welcome to the Overlook. Then, we'll look at the clash between the page and the screen, explore the architecture of madness, dive into addiction and the imprisoned psyche, and finally, look at documenting the terror. Let's jump right in. Section 1. Welcome to the Overlook, the Stanley Hotel Nightmare.
So to really understand the Overlook, we've got to travel back to late September of 1974. Stephen King and his wife Tabitha spent a single night at the grand but almost completely empty Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado. They were literally the only guests there, right before the place closed down for the long winter. And that night, King had a horrific nightmare. He dreamt of his 3-year-old son sprinting through those empty corridors, screaming, being chased by a fire hose. King woke up in a cold sweat, practically falling out of bed. And honestly, by the time he finished a cigarette while staring out at the Rockies, the bones of his 1977 novel were already set. But here's the thing. It wasn't just a spooky dream. King was channeling his own very real, very raw struggles with alcoholism and his deep-seated terror that his personal demons might end up tearing his family apart.
Moving on to Section 2, the page versus the screen, a clash of visions. Now that deeply personal foundation brings us to the adaptations. And look, Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film is an absolute masterpiece of cinema, no doubt about it, but it is fundamentally a totally different beast from King's novel. The real difference lies in genre and intent. As our sources point out, King viewed his novel essentially as a tragedy. It's a family drama that just happens to be wrapped in horror. It focuses on a fundamentally decent guy trying his hardest to be a better husband and father, but who keeps getting sabotaged by his own demons. Kubrick, on the other hand, he crafted a taut, visceral psychological thriller. His main goal was to terrify you, to keep the audience feeling completely claustrophobic and on edge. Essentially, the film is a horror movie with elements of family drama, while the book is a family drama dropped right into a horrific setting. And honestly, nowhere is this clash more obvious than with Jack Torrance himself. In the book, Jack is surprisingly sympathetic. His very real struggle with addiction is front and center. He uses a roque mallet, not an axe, and crucially, the novel actually grants him a tragic paternal redemption. He fights off the hotel's possession just long enough to save his son, ultimately dying in a fiery boiler explosion that takes the whole hotel down with it. But then you look at movie Jack. He feels completely unhinged from the very first frame, right? His childhood trauma is entirely absent, he famously wields that axe, and the film literally leaves him out in the cold, freezing to death all alone in a hedge maze. Then we have Wendy, whose character undergoes a massive, radical transformation. Book Wendy is headstrong, staggeringly beautiful, and fiercely protective. She even contemplates divorce just to save her son. Movie Wendy, however, is portrayed as fearful, meek, and skittish. And there's a pretty tragic real-world context here, too. Stanley Kubrick notoriously pushed actress Shelley Duvall to the absolute brink of physical illness on set. So that on-screen hysteria and panic you see, yeah, it feels like a very real extension of Duvall's own total exhaustion during production.
And let's look at Dick Halloran, because his fate really cements the tonal difference between the two mediums. In the novel, this warm, tender chef actually survives Jack's attack. In fact, there's an epilogue showing him helping Danny and Wendy recover at a resort up in Maine. It ends on a genuine note of hope. In the film, the poor guy travels all the way through a massive snowstorm only to meet a sudden fatal end by Jack's axe the exact moment he arrives. It's a ruthless change that completely strips away the novel's hopeful resolution. Okay, before we get into the heavy psychological stuff, here's a really fun piece of trivia for you. You probably remember the terrifying, decaying woman in the bathtub, right? Well, in the book, this happens in room 217, but in the movie, it's room 237. Why the change? Because the Timberline Lodge, where the exterior shots were filmed, actually asked Kubrick to change it to a non-existent room number. They were legitimately worried that if they used 217, real-life guests would be way too terrified to ever book it.
All right, Section 3, the architecture of madness, focusing on Gothic domesticity.
So, moving beyond just the plot differences, we really need to examine the Overlook Hotel not merely as a location, but as an active, malevolent character. For this, we are drawing from a super insightful academic paper published in the International Journal of English Literature and Social Sciences. It takes a deep dive into the profound theme of domestic entrapment, analyzing how King masterfully weaponizes the incredibly universal concept of the home.
The paper introduces this fascinating concept called Gothic domesticity. Think about it. Normally, your home is a place of peace, but in Gothic domesticity, these private familial spaces totally invert. They transform into sites of cruelty, fear, and absolute confinement. The terror here doesn't come from some alien invasion or a monster hiding in the woods. It comes from the caregiver. The patriarch becomes the predator, and the home itself literally becomes the monster.
So, how exactly does the Overlook pull this off? How does it exert this kind of control? Well, first off, there's the extreme winter isolation. Massive snowdrifts physically imprison the family, completely cutting off any hope of external rescue. Second, the sheer labyrinthine size of the hotel doesn't offer freedom. Its endless looping corridors overwhelm the mind and perfectly reflect Jack's own mental labyrinth. And third, the hotel is deeply infected by its own violent history. It actually mimics and personifies past traumas, dragging the family's deepest anxieties right out into the physical world. Which brings us to Section 4, Addiction and the Imprisoned Psyche, or the Weaponization of Vulnerability. This physical imprisonment leads us directly into the mind. You see, the physical entrapment of the hotel perfectly mirrors Jack's psychological entrapment. There's this chilling line from the novel. The hotel was awake, not just alive but awake. It underscores a truly terrifying reality for the Torrance family. The Overlook isn't just some passive building housing a few dusty ghosts. It is a sentient, calculating antagonist that actively preys on Jack's deepest insecurities and weaknesses. So, what's the psychology behind this trap? Our academic source points out that the hotel uses addiction as its absolute primary weapon of control. It relentlessly feeds off Jack's history of alcoholism, his immense guilt over past failures, and his boiling, unaddressed anger. It literally manifests phantom drinks, remember those chilling scenes with Lloyd the bartender, offering Jack false comfort. It gives him what he desires most, just to control him, slowly convincing him that his true purpose lies with the hotel and that his own family is the enemy standing in his way. And this all builds to the ultimate tragedy, perfectly captured in another quote highlighted by the research. He was the hotel, and the hotel was him. It's so eerie, right? Because it illustrates the complete and utter erasure of Jack's identity. The Gothic prison claims its prize. It consumes the caretaker entirely until there is absolutely no boundary left between the man's mind and the haunted walls surrounding him. Finally, Section 5, Documenting the Terror, the 1980 masterpiece. The legacy of this story, especially Kubrick's visual interpretation, has spawned an obsessive fan culture and deep historical analysis that's unlike almost any other film out there. Just recently, in 2023, a monumental book was published by Taschen, filmmaker Lee Unkrich, who you might actually know from Pixar, and the late film historian J.W. Rinsler spent years painstakingly compiling the definitive behind-the-scenes history of Kubrick's adaptation. Thanks to unprecedented access to Kubrick's personal archives, they unearthed rare set photographs, original production documents, and annotated scripts that detail the absolute madness and genius of the production. 1,396 pages. That is the staggering page count of this nonfiction compendium. To put that into perspective, it's essentially a massive 2-volume encyclopedia dedicated to a single horror film. This crazy scale brilliantly demonstrates the enduring cultural obsession we still have with this movie. Decades later, we are all still completely captivated, endlessly trying to map the labyrinth Kubrick built. Which brings us to the end of our explainer. We've journeyed from a terrifying nightmare in Colorado, through the clash between King's tragedy and Kubrick's thriller, and straight into the dark architecture of Gothic domesticity. So I want to leave you with this lingering thought to chew on. In the end, what truly terrifies us about The Shining? Is the real monster the supernatural sentient hotel, or is it the inescapable darkness that lurks inside the human mind, just waiting for the exact right kind of isolation to break free? Think about that next time the snow starts falling. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.